On Mother's Day, I got a single message from my daughter-in-law. "You don't deserve love. Not from him, not from anyone." I didn't reply. That evening, she walked into the lobby of her luxury penthouse. The doorman handed her a letter. She didn't finish reading it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got to that point. Because the woman who received that letter that night had no idea who she was really dealing with. The message arrived at 11:47 a.m. on what should have been a beautiful Mother's Day morning. I was sitting in my kitchen, still in my robe, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I stared out the window at the garden Richard and I had planted together 15 years ago. The tulips were blooming, just like they did every spring. A small reminder that some things endure even when everything else falls apart. My phone buzzed against the wooden table. I almost didn't check it. David rarely texted anymore. And when he did, it was usually brief, formal messages about holidays or obligations.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
Thanks for the birthday card, Mom. Hope you're doing well. The kind of messages you send to a distant relative. Not your mother who raised you alone after your father died when you were 12. But this message wasn't from David. It was from Victoria. The words hit me like a physical blow. I read them twice. Then 3 times, hoping I had misunderstood. But there was no misunderstanding Victoria's elegant, educated cruelty. She had a gift for finding exactly the right words to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. If I ever confronted her about it, she would simply say I was being too sensitive, that I had misinterpreted her meaning. I set the phone down with hands that trembled slightly and looked around my small kitchen. This house had been my sanctuary for 35 years, the place where Richard and I had built our life together, where we had raised David with love and sacrifice and endless hope for his future. Now it felt like a museum of a life that no longer mattered to anyone but me. The message hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of 5 years of systematic exclusion, 5 years of watching my son transform from the loving, thoughtful boy I had raised into someone I barely recognized. It started small, the way these things always do. Dinner plans that were suddenly canceled. Holiday celebrations that were moved to times when I couldn't attend. Phone calls that grew shorter and less frequent until they stopped altogether unless I initiated them. Victoria had been strategic about it, I realized now. She never openly forbade David from seeing me. She was far too clever for that. Instead, she created situations where choosing me became the difficult option, the source of conflict and stress in their marriage. She made herself the path of least resistance. And David, like most people, chose the easier road. The latest exclusion had been the cruelest yet. 3 weeks ago, I had called David to ask about Victoria's pregnancy. She was 5 months along with their first child, my first grandchild, and I hadn't heard any updates in over a month. David sounded distracted when he answered, hurried. "Oh, Mom, I meant to call you. We had the gender reveal party last weekend. It's a boy." "A gender reveal party?" I had tried to keep my voice steady. "That sounds lovely. I'm so happy for you both." "Yeah, Victoria planned this whole thing with balloons and a cake. It was really special." The silence stretched between us until I finally asked the question that was burning in my throat. "Was I not invited?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Mom, you know how Victoria gets about these things. She wanted to keep it small, just close family and friends. She was worried it might be too much stress for you, with your blood pressure and everything." My blood pressure was fine. I was 65, not 95. But Victoria had spent years planting seeds of doubt about my health, my mental state, my ability to handle social situations. She painted me as fragile and difficult, someone who needed to be managed rather than included. I understand I had lied, because what else could I say? That I wanted to be there to celebrate my first grandchild? That I had been looking forward to this moment for months? That being excluded from such a significant milestone felt like being erased from my own family's story? After we hung up, I had driven to the grocery store and bought a tiny blue teddy bear, soft and perfect, with a little embroidered bee on its chest for baby. I wrapped it carefully and sent it with a card congratulating them both, telling them how excited I was to meet my grandson when he arrived. The card was generic, the kind you sent to acquaintances because I didn't know what else to say to my own son anymore. David never acknowledged receiving the gift. Now, sitting in my kitchen on Mother's Day with Victoria's message glowing on my phone screen, I felt something inside me break, not the sharp, sudden break of a bone, but the slow, inevitable crumbling of a foundation that had been weakening for years. I had tried so hard to be the perfect mother-in-law, the one who never interfered, never criticized, never made demands. I had given them space when they asked for it, kept my opinions to myself when they made decisions I disagreed with, and always put their happiness above my own hurt feelings. And this was what it had gotten me. A text message on Mother's Day telling me I didn't deserve love. I finished my cold coffee and went upstairs to get dressed. I had plans to visit Richard's grave today, something I did every Mother's Day since he passed 3 years ago. It wasn't morbid, it was comforting. I would tell him about the garden, about the books I'd been reading, about how much I missed having someone to talk to who actually wanted to hear what I had to say. As I stood in front of my closet, choosing between 2 equally unremarkable dresses, my phone rang. For a moment, my heart lifted. Maybe it was David calling to wish me a happy Mother's Day. Maybe he would say that Victoria's message had been a mistake, that she had been upset about something else and had taken it out on me unfairly. But it wasn't David. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, asking if I wanted to join her family for Mother's Day brunch since her own mother was visiting from out of town. The invitation was kind, generous, and it made me want to cry because it came from a virtual stranger who somehow understood that I might be spending the day alone. I declined politely, telling her I had other plans. I couldn't bear the thought of sitting at someone else's table, pretending to be grateful for their pity while they all had their own children and grandchildren around them. I would go to the cemetery, and then I would come home, and I would figure out how to live with the fact that the family I had devoted my life to had decided I was no longer worth loving. What I didn't know then, as I drove through the quiet streets toward Greenwood Cemetery with tears blurring my vision, was that I had more power than I realized. What I didn't know was that the woman who had sent me that cruel message lived in a world that I actually controlled, though I had been too grief-stricken and too trusting to pay attention to the details of my own life. What I didn't know was that in 3 months, Victoria would be the one learning what it felt like to be unwanted, unwelcome, and utterly powerless to change her circumstances. But that revelation was still to come. For now, I was just a mother spending Mother's Day alone, trying to understand how love could turn into such calculated cruelty, and wondering if I would ever feel like I belonged anywhere again. The drive back from the cemetery gave me too much time to think. Richard's headstone looked smaller every year, weathered by seasons of rain and snow, but I had planted fresh marigolds around the base, just like he would have wanted. I told him about Victoria's message, about how David had changed, about how lonely the house felt without his laughter filling the rooms. I asked him what I should do, but of course he couldn't answer. The dead don't offer advice, no matter how desperately you need it. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed the Hendersons next door were having a barbecue. 3 generations crowded around their patio table, children running through sprinklers while grandparents watched from lawn chairs, holding babies and wiping sticky fingers. It was exactly the kind of Mother's Day I had imagined having someday, back when David was small and the future felt full of promise instead of regret. Inside my house, the silence felt heavier than usual. I made myself a sandwich I didn't want and sat at the kitchen table, staring at Victoria's message until the words blurred together. That's when the memories started flooding back. All the moments I had dismissed or rationalized away because I wanted so desperately to believe that my son's marriage was happy and healthy. It started almost immediately after their wedding 5 years ago. Victoria had been charming during their courtship, deferential even. She asked my opinion about wedding flowers, invited me dress shopping, made sure I felt included in the planning process. I should have realized it was all performance, a careful campaign to win David's heart by appearing to embrace his family. The mask slipped almost as soon as they returned from their honeymoon. The first incident was so subtle I almost missed it. We were at their apartment for Sunday dinner, something that had been a tradition since David moved out of my house at 22. I had brought homemade rolls, David's favorite since he was a child, and was arranging them in a basket when Victoria appeared beside me. "Oh, Margaret, you didn't need to bring anything," she said, her voice sweet but her eyes cold. "I've already prepared enough food. Maybe next time you could just call first to coordinate?" David was in the living room, setting up the stereo, completely oblivious to the exchange. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment as Victoria took the basket from my hands and set it aside, making it clear that my contribution wasn't welcome in her kitchen. "Of course," I said quietly. "I should have asked. It's just that David is trying to eat healthier now," Victoria continued, still smiling. All that butter and white flour isn't really part of our lifestyle anymore. I'm sure you understand. I understood perfectly. My cooking, like everything else about me, wasn't good enough for their new life together. The rolls I had been making for David since he was 7 years old were suddenly unhealthy, inappropriate. A reminder of a past Victoria wanted him to forget. The Sunday dinners became monthly, then quarterly, then stopped altogether. When I asked David about it, he said they were too busy with work, with social obligations, with building their career. Victoria had gotten a promotion at her marketing firm, and they were networking more, attending industry events and dinner parties with her colleagues. You wouldn't really enjoy those kinds of things, Mom, David said when I suggested he could include me occasionally. They talk about business stuff you wouldn't understand, and they stay out pretty late. You know how you like to be in bed by 9. I didn't like to be in bed by 9. That was something Victoria had decided about me. Another way to paint me as elderly and out of touch, despite being only 60 at the time. But David accepted her characterization of me so completely that he never questioned whether it was accurate. The holidays were the worst. Christmas had always been our special time, the day when David would come home early and we would cook together, watch old movies, and exchange gifts that actually meant something. The first Christmas after the wedding, Victoria announced they would be spending the morning at her parents' house and would stop by mine later in the afternoon. They arrived at 4 o'clock, already full from her mother's elaborate brunch, staying just long enough to exchange perfunctory gifts before rushing off to another obligation. Victoria had given me a generic scented candle, the kind you buy in a pharmacy when you realize you've forgotten someone. David gave me a gift card to a department store, impersonal and practical. Nothing like the thoughtful presents we used to choose for each other. I had spent weeks knitting David a sweater in his favorite color, navy blue, the same shade as his father's eyes. Victoria barely glanced at it before suggesting he might prefer something more contemporary from the store where the gift card was from. The pattern continued year after year, each exclusion slightly more obvious than the last. Victoria's birthday parties that happened to be scheduled when I was out of town visiting my sister. David's work celebrations that were just for employees and their spouses. The housewarming party for their new place that I only heard about after the fact, when David mentioned it casually during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations. The most painful was David's promotion dinner 2 years ago. He had worked for months on a presentation that earned him a senior management position at his architectural firm, the kind of professional milestone that made me burst with pride. I had planned to take him out to celebrate, maybe to that steakhouse downtown where his father used to take him for special occasions. But when I called to suggest it, David sounded uncomfortable. Actually, Mom, the company is throwing a dinner for all the promoted employees and their families. It's this Friday at the Riverside Club. That sounds wonderful, I said, waiting for the invitation that didn't come. Yeah, Victoria's really excited. She bought a new dress and everything. It's going to be pretty fancy. I'm sure you'll both have a lovely time, I said finally, understanding that I wasn't included in families anymore. Thanks, Mom. I'll call you afterward and tell you all about it. He didn't call. I found out later from his Facebook page that the dinner had been a huge success, that Victoria had charmed all his colleagues and their wives, that she had given a speech about how proud she was of her husband's accomplishments. In the photos, she stood beside David with her hand on his arm, smiling radiantly as he accepted his award. They looked like the perfect couple, successful and happy and complete without anyone else. That's when I realized what Victoria had been doing all along. She wasn't just excluding me from their life. She was rewriting their story so that I had never been part of it at all. In Victoria's version of David's success, she was the supportive wife who had encouraged his ambition, who had sacrificed her own time and energy to help him climb the corporate ladder. There was no room in that narrative for the mother who had worked 2 jobs to pay for his college, who had sat up with him during countless late-night study sessions, who had believed in his dreams when no one else did. The worst part was watching David accept this revised history. He began referring to Victoria as his biggest supporter, crediting her with pushing him to take risks and pursue opportunities. When people asked about his background, he talked about growing up in a traditional family, without mentioning that his father had died when he was 12, that I had raised him alone while building my own career as a bookkeeper to keep us afloat. It was as if Victoria had performed surgery on David's memory, carefully removing every trace of my influence while leaving no visible scars. She did it with such skill that even I began to question my own recollections. Had I really been that important to his development? Had my sacrifices really mattered as much as I thought they had? The pregnancy announcement last year should have been a new beginning, a chance for me to prove my worth as a grandmother and earn my way back into their lives. Instead, It became another opportunity for Victoria to assert her control. She developed elaborate restrictions about germs and stress levels that made visiting complicated and brief. She enrolled in exclusive prenatal classes that created a new social circle of other expectant couples, people who shared her values and lifestyle in ways I apparently couldn't. When I offered to throw her a baby shower, Victoria politely declined, saying she preferred something more intimate with her close friends. When I volunteered to babysit after the baby was born, she explained that they would be using a professional nanny service because they wanted someone with proper training in infant care. Every offer of help was declined. Every gesture of love was politely but firmly rejected. I began to feel like a door-to-door salesman peddling products no one wanted, increasingly desperate and increasingly pathetic with each futile attempt to matter. The gender reveal party 3 weeks ago had been the final humiliation, 25 people celebrating my grandson's impending arrival, and I learned about it after the fact through a casual mention in a phone call. Victoria's parents were there, of course, her college friends, her work colleagues, David's new social circle from the country club they had joined, everyone except the baby's grandmother. That night, I had sat in David's old bedroom, surrounded by his childhood trophies and school photos, trying to understand how I had become so dispensable. The boy in those pictures wouldn't have excluded me from something so important. He would have insisted I be there, would have saved me a piece of the cake, would have called me the moment the balloon was released to tell me whether he was having a son or daughter, but that boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw me through Victoria's eyes. Outdated, inconvenient, a reminder of a simpler time that didn't fit their sophisticated new life. I had raised him to be independent, to think for himself, to question authority when necessary. I never imagined he would use those skills to question me. Now, sitting in my kitchen with the Mother's Day shadows growing longer, I finally understood the full scope of what Victoria had accomplished. She hadn't just married my son, she had stolen him, piece by piece, memory by memory, until nothing remained of the relationship we had built over 28 years of shared history, and tomorrow, I would have to find a way to live with that knowledge. The phone rang as I was washing my dinner dishes, a single plate and cup that somehow felt more lonely than all the empty space around them. I dried my hands slowly, hoping it might be David calling to apologize for Victoria's message, to explain that she had been having a difficult day with the pregnancy and hadn't meant what she said. But when I answered, it was only a telemarketer asking if I was interested in Medicare supplemental insurance. I hung up without being rude, but the interruption left me feeling even more isolated than before. As I prepared for bed, I found myself standing in the hallway outside David's old room, remembering the nights I had checked on him while he slept, marveling at how peaceful he looked, how much like his father. I had loved him so fiercely, so completely, that I never imagined there would come a day when that love wouldn't be enough to keep us connected. But tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new discoveries that would change everything I thought I knew about my own life. I just didn't know it yet. The morning after Mother's Day dawned gray and humid, the kind of weather that makes everything feel sluggish and uncertain. I had barely slept, my mind churning through decades of memories, trying to pinpoint exactly when I had lost my son to Victoria's careful manipulation. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's face as it used to be, open and loving, before it became guarded and distant whenever he looked at me. I made coffee and toast I couldn't taste, then sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of mail I had been ignoring for weeks. Bills, advertisements, renewal notices for subscriptions I no longer cared about. The mundane paperwork of a life that felt increasingly meaningless. But underneath it all was a thick manila envelope from Richard's estate attorney. Something I had been putting off opening because legal documents always made me feel overwhelmed and stupid. The envelope had been sitting there for 3 weeks, sealed and forbidding, with urgent estate documents requiring review, stamped in red across the front. I had been meaning to call Mr. Williamson to schedule an appointment, but every time I picked up the phone, I found reasons to postpone it. Richard had been dead for 3 years. What could possibly be urgent about his estate now? But sitting there in my empty kitchen, with nothing but silence and regret for company, I decided it was time to face whatever bureaucratic nightmare awaited me. I tore open the envelope and spread the contents across the table, trying to make sense of the legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Most of it was routine paperwork about tax filings and investment accounts I barely understood. Richard had always handled our finances, and after his death, I had simply signed whatever Mr. Williamson put in front of me, trusting that he was managing everything properly. I received monthly statements that showed healthy balances, but I never looked at them closely enough to understand what I actually owned. One document caught my attention because it had David's name on it. It was a lease agreement for something called Riverside Towers, Unit 2847. The address looked familiar, but I couldn't place it immediately. The monthly rent was listed as $12,000, an astronomical amount that made me blink twice to make sure I had read it correctly. Who on earth could afford to pay $12,000 a month for an apartment? As I studied the document more carefully, my heart began to race. The lease was dated 4 years ago, and the signature on the tenant line was unmistakably David's. But even more shocking was the signature on the landlord line, my own name, written in Richard's familiar handwriting. I stared at the paper until the words began to blur, trying to process what I was seeing. David and Victoria lived in a luxury penthouse in Riverside Towers, one of the most exclusive buildings in the city. I knew this because Victoria had posted countless photos of their stunning views and marble countertops on social media, always with captions about how blessed they were to live in such a beautiful space. What I didn't know, what I had somehow never understood despite signing documents year after year, was that I owned their building. My hand shaking, I searched through the rest of the papers until I found what I was looking for. The deed to Riverside Towers, purchased by Richard 15 years ago as what the documents called a long-term investment property. My name was listed as the sole owner following his death, inheriting not just his half of the property but the entire building through some complex legal arrangement I had never bothered to understand. I owned a 20-story luxury apartment building in downtown, and my son had been living in the penthouse for 4 years without either of us realizing the connection. The lease agreement showed that David paid only $4,000 monthly instead of the market rate of $12,000, a family discount that Richard had apparently arranged through the property management company, without telling me the details. The savings over 4 years amounted to nearly $400,000, money that had stayed in my accounts while David and Victoria enjoyed a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. I sat back in my chair, feeling dizzy. No wonder Victoria could afford designer clothes and expensive furniture on David's architect salary. No wonder they could join the country club and take luxury vacations and throw elaborate parties. They were living in a penthouse worth millions, paying a fraction of its true cost, subsidized by the very woman Victoria had spent 5 years trying to erase from their lives. The irony was so complete, so perfect, that I almost laughed. Victoria had crafted an entire identity around being successful and sophisticated, better than David's ordinary mother, who lived in a modest house and shopped at discount stores. She had positioned herself as the one who brought class and culture to David's life, the one who elevated him above his humble background. But her entire lifestyle was built on my money. Every designer dress, every exclusive dinner party, every moment of superiority she had enjoyed was funded by the inheritance from the husband of the woman she had treated with such contempt. I found my phone and called Mr. Williamson's office, my voice surprisingly steady when his secretary answered. "This is Margaret Walsh. I need to schedule an urgent meeting with Mr. Williamson about my estate documents. Today, if possible. Let me check his calendar. Mrs. Walsh, he has a cancellation at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Would that work for you? Perfect. I'll be there." I spent the rest of the morning reading through every document in the envelope, piece by piece, until I understood the full scope of what Richard had left me. The apartment building was just one part of a portfolio that included several commercial properties, investment accounts, and business interests I had never known existed. On paper, I was worth considerably more than David and Victoria probably imagined, certainly more than I had ever realized myself. Richard had been protecting me. I understood now. He had structured everything so that I would be financially secure no matter what happened, but he had also been subtle about it, knowing that I would be overwhelmed by the responsibility if I understood it all at once. He had trusted Mr. Williamson to guide me through the complexities gradually, at my own pace. What he couldn't have predicted was that I would be so paralyzed by grief that I would ignore the details of my own financial life for 3 years, signing papers without reading them, accepting explanations without asking questions. At 2 o'clock sharp, I walked into Mr. Williamson's office carrying the manila envelope and a list of questions I had written in careful block letters. He was a kind man in his 60s, the same attorney who had handled Richard's business affairs for over 20 years, and his face showed genuine concern when he saw my expression. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm glad you finally called. I've been hoping you would take a more active interest in your holdings. There are several matters we need to discuss." "I want to know about Riverside Towers," I said, spreading the lease agreement on his desk. "I want to know everything." Mr. Williamson nodded slowly. I wondered when you would ask about that. Your son has been an excellent tenant, never late with rent, very respectful of the property. But I did think it was odd that he never mentioned the connection to you. He doesn't know, I said quietly. Neither of them knows. Ah. Mr. Williamson leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to process this information. That does complicate things. The lease is up for renewal in 3 months. I've been preparing the paperwork assuming you would want to continue the family arrangement. What if I don't want to continue it? Well, legally, you have every right to change the terms or decline to renew entirely. The lease clearly states that it's subject to annual review at the owner's discretion. But may I ask why you're considering this? Has something happened between you and your son? I told him about Victoria's message, about the years of exclusion and manipulation, about how I had been systematically removed from my own son's life, while unknowingly subsidizing the lifestyle that made Victoria feel superior to me. Mr. Williamson listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. Mrs. Walsh, I'm very sorry to hear about this situation. Richard would be devastated to know that his provisions for David's housing were being used to enable such cruel behavior toward you. What are my options? Mr. Williamson pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across his desk. Legally, you have complete control. You can raise the rent to market rate. You can decline to renew the lease. You can sell the building entirely. The property management company handles all the day-to-day operations, so your tenants never interact with you directly unless there's a specific issue. So David has no idea that I'm his landlord? Correct. All communications go through the management company. His checks are made out to Riverside Property Management, and they deposit them into your account after taking their fee. It's a very common arrangement for investment properties. I stared at the documents, trying to imagine David's reaction when he learned the truth. Would he be embarrassed? Angry? Would he finally understand how Victoria's cruelty had affected not just me, but his own future security? If I don't renew the lease, what happens to them? They would have 60 days to vacate the property. Given the current market rates in that area, they would probably need to find something significantly smaller and less expensive, or move to a different part of the city entirely. I thought about Victoria's social media posts, her carefully curated images of their perfect life in their perfect home. How would she explain to her friends and colleagues that they had to downsize? How would she maintain her image of success and sophistication if they were forced to live somewhere ordinary? I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, but Mrs. Walsh, if you do decide to make changes, we should begin the process soon. There are legal notice requirements, and it would be better to handle this professionally rather than emotionally, if you understand my meaning. I understood perfectly. Mr. Williamson was giving me the opportunity to use my power strategically, rather than impulsively, to make decisions based on logic rather than hurt feelings. It was exactly the kind of advice Richard would have given me. Can you prepare a letter declining to renew the lease? Nothing personal, just a standard business communication? Certainly. Should I send it to their home address? No, I said, thinking of Victoria's daily routine. Her habit of posting photos of herself in the lobby of their building, always dressed perfectly, always projecting an image of effortless elegance. Send it to the building. Have the doorman deliver it personally. When would you like this delivered? I smiled for the first time in days, feeling something that might have been power stirring in my chest. Today, late afternoon, when she's most likely to be coming home from work. Are you certain about this timing, Mrs. Walsh? Once the letter is delivered, the situation becomes official. There's no taking it back without looking capricious. I'm certain. And I was. For the first time in years, I knew exactly what I was doing and why I was doing it. Mr. Williamson nodded and reached for his phone. I'll have the letter prepared and delivered within 2 hours. You should expect some reaction from your son once they process what this means. I know. I stood up and gathered my documents, feeling lighter than I had in months. Mr. Williamson, why didn't you ever tell me about the extent of my holdings? I've been living like a woman on a fixed income when I apparently have considerable assets. Richard specifically requested that I not overwhelm you with details unless you ask directly. He wanted you to have time to grieve without worrying about business matters. But he also knew that when you were ready, you would take control of your own affairs. I think he would be very proud of the decision you're making today. As I drove home, I thought about Victoria's message from yesterday, her cold declaration that I didn't deserve love from anyone. In a few hours, she would learn what it felt like to have her own world turned upside down by someone else's decisions. she would discover that the lifestyle she had used to elevate herself above me was actually dependent on my generosity, and that generosity was about to end. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt like myself again. That evening, I sat on my front porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset and waiting for my phone to ring. Victoria would be home from work by now. The doorman would have handed her the letter. She would be reading it for the first time, trying to understand how the pathetic mother-in-law she had dismissed so easily had suddenly become the most important person in her perfectly curated life. The phone rang at 7:37 exactly. I let the phone ring 4 times before answering, taking a sip of wine and watching a neighbor walk their dog down the quiet street. When I finally picked up, David's voice was strained and breathless, as if he had been running. "Mom, we need to talk. Right now." "Hello, David. How was your day?" I kept my voice pleasantly neutral, the same tone I might use with a casual acquaintance. "Don't play games with me. We got a letter today about our lease. Victoria is—" He paused, and I could hear muffled voices in the background, Victoria's voice rising and falling in what sounded like panic. "She's really upset. This has to be some kind of mistake." "What kind of mistake?" "The letter says our lease won't be renewed, that we have 60 days to vacate, but that's impossible. We've been perfect tenants. We've never been late with rent, never caused any problems. The management company loves us." I could picture him pacing around their marble kitchen, the one Victoria had posted countless photos of, running his hand through his hair the way he used to when he was a teenager struggling with algebra homework. The gesture would be exactly the same, but the boy who used to turn to me for help with every crisis was now a stranger asking me to fix a problem he didn't understand. "That does sound concerning," I said carefully. "Have you spoken to the management company about it?" "They said it's a decision from the owner, that the owner has decided not to renew any of the current leases and is converting the building to condominiums." David's voice cracked slightly. "Mom, we can't afford to buy our apartment. The units in our building sell for over $2 million, and we can't find anything comparable for what we're paying now. Everything else in this area costs 3 times as much." I felt a small stab of sympathy for my son, who genuinely had no idea what was happening to him. David had always been trusting, accepting explanations at face value without digging deeper. It's why Victoria had been able to manipulate him so easily, and it's why he had lived for 4 years in a penthouse without questioning how he could afford it on his salary. "That's a difficult situation," I agreed. "Have you considered looking in other neighborhoods? Sometimes a change of scenery can be refreshing." "Other neighborhoods?" David's voice rose. "Mom, this isn't just about the apartment. Victoria's entire life is here. Her yoga studio, her hair salon, the gallery where she volunteers. All her friends live within walking distance, and her work is only 10 minutes away. If we move to some suburb, she'll have to give up everything she's built. Everything she's built." As if Victoria's social circle and beauty routine were architectural achievements rather than conveniences enabled by my unknowing generosity. I wondered what David would say if he knew that every yoga class Victoria had ever attended, every expensive haircut, every charity gala had been subsidized by the mother Victoria claimed didn't deserve love. "I'm sure Victoria is resourceful enough to adapt," I said. "She seems like a very capable woman." "Mom, you don't understand. This is destroying her. She's worked so hard to establish herself in this community. She's on the board of the Children's Museum. She's organizing the hospital fundraiser next month. People depend on her. People depended on her. Not David, not their unborn child, not the family she had worked so systematically to destroy. Victoria's identity was built entirely on external validation, on being seen as successful and important by people who would forget her the moment she moved to a less prestigious address. "David," I said gently, "may I ask how you've been able to afford that apartment all these years? I know what architects make, and $12,000 a month seems quite expensive for your salary level." The silence that followed was telling. I could almost hear David's mind working, trying to figure out how to explain their financial situation without admitting that he didn't really understand it himself. "The management company gave us a deal," he said finally, "because we committed to a long-term lease, and because we take such good care of the place. It's not $12,000. We pay less than that." "How much less?" Another pause. $4,000. "But Mom, that's not unusual for long-time tenants. Lots of landlords give discounts to keep good tenants rather than dealing with turnover." $4,000. A 70% discount on one of the most expensive apartments in the city. And David thought it was a normal business practice. Richard had been too generous, too protective. He had wanted to help David without making him feel dependent, but instead, he had created a situation where our son lived in a fantasy world, insulated from the real cost of his lifestyle. That's quite a substantial discount, I said. You must have been very fortunate to find such a generous landlord. Yeah, we really lucked out. That's why this is so devastating. We'll never find another deal like this. Victoria keeps saying we should have bought something years ago, but the down payment for anything decent would have been impossible to save for. Impossible to save because they had been spending the money they should have been saving on vacations and furniture and all the other luxuries that Victoria needed to maintain her image. I thought about the photos she posted constantly, the designer bags and expensive restaurant meals, the weekend trips to wine country and ski resorts. They had been living like people with inherited wealth while building no real financial security. Have you considered asking family for help? I suggested. Perhaps someone could co-sign a loan or help with a down payment. David laughed bitterly. Victoria's parents are retired on a fixed income. They're barely making ends meet themselves. And you, Mom, I know you're comfortable, but you're not wealthy. I wouldn't ask you to risk your retirement savings for something like this. You're not wealthy. I almost smiled at the irony. David thought I was comfortable because I lived modestly, because I shopped at discount stores and drove a 10-year-old car. He had no idea that I could buy their entire building in cash if I wanted to, that the rent he paid me each month was less than the interest I earned on my investment accounts. I might be willing to help if the situation were truly desperate, I said carefully. But I would need to understand more about your finances, about why you haven't been able to save anything despite living so affordably for so many years. It's complicated, David said quickly. Victoria handles most of our budgeting. She's much better with money than I am. Victoria, who had apparently never explained to her own husband that their lifestyle was unsustainable without massive subsidies. Victoria, who had spent years buying designer clothes with money that should have gone into savings, then had the audacity to look down on the woman whose generosity made it all possible. Well, I said, I suppose you'll have to make some difficult decisions. Perhaps this is an opportunity to simplify your lives, to focus on what really matters as you prepare for parenthood. Mom, we can't just simplify our way out of this. Victoria is 5 months pregnant. The stress alone could be dangerous for the baby. And where are we supposed to go? Everything in our price range is either tiny or in neighborhoods that aren't safe for raising children. I felt a flicker of genuine concern for my unborn grandchild, caught in the middle of this situation through no fault of his own. But I also knew that plenty of children grew up healthy and happy in smaller apartments, in less fashionable neighborhoods, with parents who prioritized love over luxury. I'm sure you'll figure something out, I said. Young couples face housing challenges all the time. It builds character. This isn't about character, Mom. This is about our lives falling apart for no reason. The management company won't even tell us why the owner made this decision. They just keep saying it's a business decision, that the owner wants to go in a different direction. A different direction. That was one way to put it. I was certainly going in a different direction than I had been for the past 5 years, when I had unknowingly funded Victoria's campaign to erase me from my son's life. David, I said, my voice becoming slightly firmer. Has it occurred to you that this might not be happening for no reason? That perhaps the owner knows something about their tenants that influences their business decisions? What do you mean? I mean that landlords pay attention to more than just rent payments. They notice how tenants treat the building, how they interact with staff, whether they're the kind of people who enhance or detract from the property's reputation. We've always been respectful to everyone in the building, David protested. Victoria chats with the doormen all the time. She brings them coffee during the holidays. Victoria chats with the doormen. I wondered if those chats involved the same condescending tone she used with me, the same assumption that service workers existed for her convenience. I wondered if the doormen smiled and accepted her coffee while privately rolling their eyes at her transparent attempts to buy their loyalty. Perhaps the owner simply feels it's time for a change, I said. Sometimes people want to distance themselves from tenants who don't share their values. What values? We're good people, Mom. We pay our bills. We don't cause trouble. We're having a baby. What more could a landlord want? What more could a landlord want? How about tenants who treated their families with basic decency? How about tenants who understood that kindness mattered more than social status? How about tenants who didn't send cruel messages to elderly women on Mother's Day? I'm sure the owner has their reasons, I said finally. Perhaps it's nothing personal at all, but of course it was personal. It was the most personal thing I had done in years. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with David growing increasingly desperate and me maintaining the same tone of sympathetic but unhelpful concern. He wanted me to call the management company on his behalf, to use whatever influence a longtime resident might have to change the owner's mind. He suggested I could write a character reference letter, vouching for their worthiness as tenants. "I'll think about what I can do," I promised, knowing I would do exactly nothing. After we hung up, I poured myself another glass of wine and tried to imagine what was happening in their penthouse at that moment. Victoria would be pacing frantically, her perfectly ordered world suddenly chaotic and uncertain. She would be making lists of potential apartments, calculating moving costs, trying to figure out how to maintain her lifestyle on a budget that reflected their actual income rather than my subsidies. She would also be looking for someone to blame. Victoria wasn't the type of person who accepted responsibility when things went wrong. She would find a way to make this crisis someone else's fault. Probably mine, though she wouldn't understand how. My phone buzzed with a text message. David again. "Mom, would you be willing to co-sign a lease for us? Just temporarily, until we can figure out our long-term plans?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "I'll need to think about it. This is a big decision." It wasn't a decision at all. I wouldn't co-sign anything for a woman who had told me I didn't deserve love, but I wanted them to spend a few days thinking I might help, planning strategies that would never work, growing more anxious as they realized how limited their options really were. On Wednesday morning, I received a call from Mr. Williamson. "Mrs. Walsh, I thought you should know that the management company has received several calls from your son and daughter-in-law. They're asking about the possibility of purchasing their unit, or negotiating a lease extension, or speaking directly with the owner about special circumstances." What did the management company tell them? Exactly what I instructed them to say, that the owner's decision is final, that the building is being converted to condominiums as part of a long-term investment strategy, and that no exceptions will be made. They also mentioned that if the current tenants want to purchase their units, they would need to qualify for financing like any other buyers. Perfect. Any other developments? The daughter-in-law called yesterday demanding to know why they weren't given more notice about the conversion. She seemed quite agitated when she was told that 60 days is standard and legally sufficient for month-to-month arrangements. I could picture Victoria's face during that conversation, her shock at being treated like an ordinary tenant rather than someone deserving special consideration. She had probably expected her charm and social connections to open doors, to find her a sympathetic ear who would bend the rules for such an obviously deserving young family. How are they handling the purchase option? They scheduled an appointment with the sales office for Friday afternoon. But Mrs. Walsh, based on your son's income information that they provided, there's virtually no chance they'll qualify for a mortgage on a $2 million property. Even with the maximum down payment they could potentially manage, the monthly payments would be more than his entire salary. So by Friday evening, David and Victoria would have the final confirmation that their fairy tale was ending. They would sit in a sterile sales office while a polite but firm loan officer explained that their lifestyle had been built on foundations that were crumbling away. That's when the real panic would set in. That's when they would realize that their options were not just limited, but genuinely dire. That's when Victoria would understand that all her careful social positioning had been meaningless, without the financial cushion she had never even known existed. I had 45 more days to watch them discover what their lives looked like without my unconscious generosity. 45 days to see whether David would finally recognize what Victoria had really cost him. And then, perhaps, my son would be ready to have an honest conversation about family, about loyalty, and about the difference between deserving love and earning it. Friday afternoon arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of spring day that makes everything feel possible and new. I spent the morning in my garden, planting the summer vegetables Richard and I used to grow together, my hands deep in the rich soil, while my mind wandered to what was happening across town in the sterile conference room of Riverside Tower's sales office. By now, David and Victoria would be sitting across from a loan officer, their faces growing pale as reality crystallized around them like ice forming on a window. The numbers wouldn't lie, no matter how desperately they wanted them to. $2 million for their penthouse, monthly payments that exceeded David's entire salary, a down payment that would require them to liquidate every asset they had and still fall hundreds of thousands of dollars short. I had timed my next move carefully. While they were discovering the impossibility of their situation, while Victoria's carefully constructed world was crumbling around her manicured fingernails, my second letter would be making its way to their building. This letter was different from the first. Where the lease termination had been cold and professional, a standard business communication that revealed nothing about motivation or personal feelings, this new message was designed to pull back the curtain completely. Victoria needed to understand not just that she was losing her lifestyle, but exactly why, and exactly who held the power she had so dramatically underestimated. I had spent 3 days crafting it, weighing each word for maximum impact. The tone was calm, almost gentle, but the content was devastating. It explained everything: how I had inherited the building from Richard, how David's rent had been subsidized for 4 years without his knowledge, how Victoria's entire social identity had been built on my unwitting generosity. But the most important part was the ending, where I quoted her own words back to her. "You don't deserve love. Not from him, not from anyone." I wanted her to understand that actions had consequences, that cruelty towards someone she saw as powerless could result in very real losses when that person turned out to hold all the cards. The letter was being delivered by messenger service at exactly 4 o'clock, time to arrive just as Victoria would be returning from the most humiliating meeting of her life. She would walk into the marble lobby of her soon-to-be former home, still reeling from the loan officer's rejection, and the doorman would hand her an envelope that would complete her understanding of how thoroughly her world had just collapsed. At 3:30, I poured myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite armchair with a book I couldn't concentrate on. The waiting was almost peaceful now. For weeks I had been consumed with anger and hurt, but those emotions had crystallized into something calmer and more purposeful. I wasn't acting out of spite anymore, but from a deep certainty that Victoria needed to learn what it felt like to be truly powerless. My phone rang at 4:15. Not David this time, but an unknown number with a local area code. "Is this Margaret Walsh?" The voice was female, shaky and barely controlled. "This is Margaret. This is Victoria Morrison. I think we need to talk." Victoria had never called me directly before. In 5 years of marriage to my son, every communication had gone through David. Every invitation had been filtered through his voice. Every rejection had been softened by his presence. Hearing her speak my name, hearing the tremor in her voice, was more satisfying than I had expected. "Hello, Victoria. How was your meeting today?" A sharp intake of breath. She hadn't expected me to know about the meeting, hadn't anticipated that I might be following their situation more closely than I let on. "You know about that? I make it my business to stay informed about things that matter to me." Another pause, longer this time. When Victoria spoke again, her voice was smaller, uncertain in a way I had never heard before. "Margaret, I got your letter. I don't understand. How is this possible?" "Which part don't you understand? The fact that I own your building, or the fact that your lifestyle has been subsidized by the woman you told doesn't deserve love?" "I never meant," she started, then stopped. Even Victoria, master manipulator that she was, couldn't find a way to reframe her Mother's Day message as anything other than deliberate cruelty. "You never meant what exactly? You never meant to exclude me from my son's life? You never meant to turn my grandchild into a stranger? You never meant to make me feel like an unwelcome burden in my own family?" "It wasn't personal," Victoria said weakly. David needed to focus on building our life together. Having too many family obligations was holding him back. Family obligations. As if loving me, visiting me, including me in their celebrations was some kind of burden that prevented David from reaching his potential. As if the woman who had raised him alone, who had sacrificed her own dreams to ensure his success, was nothing more than an inconvenient obligation. "And how did that work out for you?" I asked pleasantly. "This life you built without family obligations?" Victoria was quiet for so long I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, the words came out in a rush, desperate and pleading. "Margaret, please. I know I made mistakes. I know I wasn't always kind to you, but this will destroy us. David doesn't know about any of this. He doesn't know about the rent discount. He doesn't know you own the building. If he finds out, it will kill him." "Why would it kill him?" "Because he'll realize that everything we have, everything we've built, was only possible because of you. And he'll know that I ruined it by treating you badly. He'll never forgive me." There it was. The admission I had been waiting for. Victoria understood perfectly what she had done, and what it would cost her. She knew that David, whatever his flaws, was fundamentally a decent person, who would be horrified to learn that his wife had been systematically cruel to the woman who had been secretly supporting their lifestyle. "That's a risk you should have considered before you decided I was disposable," I said. "Please, I'm begging you. What do you want? I'll do anything." "What I want," I said slowly, savoring each word, "is for you to understand what powerlessness feels like. What it's like to have your future decided by someone who sees you as worthless." "I never said you were worthless." You said I didn't deserve love. From anyone. On Mother's Day. My voice hardened. Did you think there would be no consequences for that? Victoria started crying then. Not the delicate tears of a woman accustomed to sympathy, but ugly. Desperate sobs that she couldn't control. I listened without comment, feeling no satisfaction in her breakdown, but no pity either. She had chosen this path when she chose cruelty over kindness. Margaret, please, she gasped between sobs. I'm pregnant. The stress of this, of losing our home, it could hurt the baby. Is that what you want? To punish an innocent child? Playing the pregnancy card. Of course, Victoria would use anything, even her unborn son, as a shield against the consequences of her own actions. But I had expected this manipulation and was ready for it. The baby will be fine, I said calmly. Children don't need marble countertops and views of the river to thrive. What they need is parents who understand the value of family, who treat others with decency and respect. Perhaps this experience will teach you both something important about what really matters. We'll be homeless. You'll be living somewhere you can actually afford. There's a difference. David will leave me when he finds out what I've done. That's between you and David. But Victoria, if your marriage can't survive the truth about who you really are, then perhaps it wasn't worth preserving. I could hear her hyperventilating on the other end of the line, her breathing rapid and shallow. Part of me, the part that had been trained by decades of putting others' needs first, wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay. But a larger part, the part that had been systematically diminished and dismissed for 5 years, felt only a cold satisfaction. What can I do? She whispered. Tell me what I can do to fix this. You can start by telling David the truth. All of it. Tell him about the rent subsidies. Tell him about how you've treated me. Tell him about the message you sent me on Mother's Day. Let him decide for himself what kind of woman he married and what kind of mother he wants for his child. I can't. He'll hate me, then you have a choice to make. You can tell him yourself and maybe find a way to earn his forgiveness, or you can wait for him to discover it on his own and face his anger and disappointment without any possibility of redemption. Victoria was quiet again, and when she spoke, her voice was small and defeated. When do we have to be out? You have 55 days remaining on your lease. And there's nothing I can do to change your mind? I thought about that question seriously, not because I was wavering in my decision, but because I wanted to give her a complete and honest answer. Victoria, for 5 years you have systematically excluded me from my son's life. You have made me feel unwelcome in my own family, unwanted at celebrations, unnecessary to people I love more than my own life. You have taught my grandchildren to see me as a burden rather than a blessing. And when I was at my lowest point, grieving and lonely and questioning my own worth, you sent me a message telling me I didn't deserve love from anyone. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle between us. If you had shown me even the smallest kindness during that time, if you had included me even occasionally in your lives, if you had treated me with basic human decency, we would not be having this conversation. But you chose cruelty. You chose to make me invisible. So no, there is nothing you can do to change my mind. Victoria hung up without saying goodbye. I set my phone on the side table and returned to my book, but the words still wouldn't focus. Instead, I found myself thinking about David, about how he would react when Victoria finally told him the truth. Would he be angry at her for deceiving him? Or would he find a way to blame me for not being more transparent about my financial situation? Knowing my son, he would probably feel both. David had inherited his father's sense of fairness, but also his tendency to avoid conflict by finding middle ground even when none existed. He would want to believe that both Victoria and I had acted with good intentions, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding that could be resolved with enough conversation and compromise. But some things couldn't be compromised away. Some hurts cut too deep for polite explanations and mutual apologies. Victoria had spent 5 years teaching David to see me as less important than his new life, less deserving of consideration than his wife's preferences. Now he would have to choose whether to continue accepting that narrative or to recognize what it had really cost both of us. My phone buzzed with a text message. David this time. Mom, can you come over tonight? Victoria and I need to talk to you about something important. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I'm afraid I have other plans tonight. Perhaps we can schedule something for next week. It was a lie. I had no plans beyond a quiet evening with dinner and a movie. But Victoria needed time to sit with the truth, to understand fully what she had lost and why. David needed time to process whatever version of the story she chose to tell him. And I needed time to prepare for whatever came next. Because while this phase of my plan was ending, with Victoria finally understanding the scope of her powerlessness, the real test was still to come. Soon, David would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be, one who enabled his wife's cruelty toward his mother, or one who demanded better from the people he loved. The answer to that question would determine not just whether our relationship could be repaired, but whether it was worth repairing at all. Outside my window, the spring afternoon was fading into evening, the last light painting my garden in shades of gold and green. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new opportunities for both healing and hurt. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt like the author of my own story, rather than a character being written out of someone else's. 3 days passed before David showed up at my door unannounced. I was transplanting seedlings in my garden when I heard his car in the driveway, the engine cutting off with a finality that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. Through the kitchen window, I watched him sit in his car for several minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. When he finally knocked, his face was haggard, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. He looked like a man who had spent 72 hours discovering that everything he thought he knew about his life was wrong. "Mom," his voice cracked on the single word. "We need to talk." I led him to the kitchen table where we had shared so many conversations when he was growing up, where I had helped him with homework and listened to his dreams and fears. But this conversation would be different. This time, I wasn't the one seeking understanding. "Victoria told me everything," he said without preamble, "about the building, about the rent, about what she said to you on Mother's Day." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Mom, I had no idea. I swear to you, I had no idea about any of it." I believed him. David had many flaws, but deliberate deception wasn't one of them. He was the type of person who accepted explanations at face value, who trusted others to handle details he found boring or complicated. Victoria had taken advantage of that trusting nature to build a life of lies. "What exactly did she tell you?" "That you've been paying for our apartment this whole time. That the discount we got wasn't because we were good tenants, but because you own the building, and Richard set up some kind of subsidy without telling anyone." His voice broke slightly. "Mom, we've been living off your money for 4 years while Victoria treated you like garbage. And how do you feel about that?" David stared at his hands, shame radiating from every line of his body. "I feel sick. I feel like I don't know who I married. I keep thinking about all the times she said you were being dramatic, that you were trying to create problems between us. All those times she said you just needed to accept that things change when people get married. But you believed her." "I did." He looked up at me then, and I saw the boy he used to be, the one who had always been honest about his mistakes. I wanted to believe her because it was easier than dealing with conflict. Victoria made it clear that choosing you meant choosing against her, and I took the path of least resistance. At least he was being honest. That was more than I had gotten from him in years. "David, do you understand what the last 5 years have been like for me? Watching you transform from my loving son into someone who saw me as an obligation? Being excluded from celebrations, ignored at holidays, treated like I was somehow too fragile or too difficult to be included in your life? I'm starting to understand." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Victoria showed me the letter you sent, the one explaining everything. She said you quoted her message back to her. The one about not deserving love. Did she tell you what prompted her to send that message?" David shook his head, but his expression suggested he was beginning to suspect. "She sent it on Mother's Day, after I discovered I hadn't been invited to your baby's gender reveal party. 25 people celebrating my grandchild, and I found out about it during a casual phone conversation." David's face went white. "The gender reveal party. She said it was just a small thing with a few close friends. 25 people. David. Including her parents, her college friends, your colleagues from work. Everyone except your mother. Oh, God." He put his head in his hands. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this." "The question isn't how to fix it," I said gently. "The question is whether you want to fix it, and what you're willing to do differently going forward." "What do you mean?" "I mean that saying sorry isn't enough anymore. Victoria has shown you who she really is. She's shown you that she's willing to accept financial support from someone she treats with contempt, that she's capable of systematic cruelty toward a woman who has never done anything but love her family. The question is, what kind of man do you want to be? Someone who enables that behavior, or someone who demands better? David was quiet for a long time, processing not just my words, but the implications of the choice in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier. I've asked Victoria to move in with her parents temporarily. I need time to think about our marriage, about what kind of environment I want to raise my son in. I felt a flutter of hope, quickly followed by caution. And how did she respond to that? She's angry. She says you're manipulating the situation to destroy our marriage, that you're using your money as a weapon against her. He met my eyes. But Mom, even if that were true, it doesn't change what she did. It doesn't excuse 5 years of treating you like you didn't matter. And what have you decided about the apartment? We're moving out early. Victoria keeps saying we should stay and try to work something out with you, but I can't live there knowing what I know now. I can't raise my son in a home that was paid for by the grandmother he was being taught to ignore. I nodded, feeling something that might have been pride in the man my son was choosing to become. Where will you go? I found a 2-bedroom apartment across town. It's smaller, older, but it's what I can actually afford on my salary. He smiled ruefully. Victoria says it's beneath us, that we're used to a certain standard of living. But I realize now that we never earned that standard. We were living a lie. And the baby? The baby will be fine. He'll have a father who understands the difference between what you earn and what you're given, who knows the value of family and loyalty. David paused. If Victoria can learn those values too, then maybe we can rebuild our marriage. If not, he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. For the first time in years, David was putting principles before convenience, making choices based on what was right rather than what was easy. There's something else, he said. I want to pay you back. Every dollar we saved on rent, every benefit we received without knowing it. I know it will take years, but I want to make this right. David, that's not necessary. It is necessary. For me. I need to know that I'm building my own life, earning my own way. I never want to be in a position again where someone else's generosity is supporting my lifestyle without my knowledge. I understood. David needed to reclaim his integrity, to prove to himself that he could be the man his father had raised him to be. The money didn't matter to me, but his independence mattered to him. We'll work something out, I agreed. A payment plan that doesn't burden your family but allows you to restore your sense of honor. We talked for another hour, making tentative plans for him to bring the baby to visit regularly once he was born, discussing the possibility of family dinners that would actually include the whole family. It felt like the first honest conversation we had shared in years. As David prepared to leave, he turned back to me with tears in his eyes. Mom, I know I can't undo the last 5 years. I can't give you back the time we lost or the hurt Victoria caused, but if you'll let me, I want to try to be the son you raised me to be. You always were that son, I told him. You just forgot for a while. After he left, I sat in my garden as the sun set, feeling lighter than I had in years. The plan I had set in motion 6 weeks ago had worked better than I had dared to hope. Victoria was facing the consequences of her cruelty. David was rediscovering his values, and I had reclaimed my place in my family's story. More importantly, I had reclaimed myself. For too long, I had accepted the role of the dispensable mother-in-law, the woman whose feelings didn't matter as much as keeping peace in the family. But I was Margaret Walsh, widow of Richard Walsh, mother of David Walsh, and grandmother to a boy who would grow up knowing that family meant love, loyalty, and mutual respect. I thought about the message Victoria had sent on Mother's Day, her declaration that I didn't deserve love. She had been wrong about that, but it had taken losing everything for her to understand the mistake. Love isn't something you deserve or don't deserve. It's something you nurture, something you protect, something you honor through your actions. Victoria had forgotten that lesson, and it had cost her the life she had worked so hard to build. But David was learning it again, and that was enough. More than enough. Tomorrow, I would call Mr. Williamson about converting part of my building to affordable housing for young families. Not charity, but fair housing for people willing to work hard and treat others with decency. It seemed like a fitting use for property that had been tainted by cruelty and deception. Tonight, though, I would simply enjoy the peace of a conscience clear and a family slowly healing from wounds that had been too long ignored.